So we're all here to talk about grief, loss, and loneliness and how they impact us and how we can cope. As I mentioned, Carol mentioned, my name is Shu. I'm also part of the team here at Vision. If my slides will go, there we go. Show why this is showing. There. And so when I was asked to speak on this topic, it was just perfect. When the Carol and Dorothea and others reached out and like, oh, we have to talk about this. This is needed, and not just because we're around Valentine's Day is around the corner, but this is something that we deal with all throughout the year. And obviously, when we're closer to holidays, especially holidays like Valentine, when we're thinking about those we love, it can be a reminder of those we're missing. But also, we'll talk about here later. You see, loss and grief is not just about missing an individual per se. Sometimes we lose and we grieve things and places and habits and routines. And so we'll talk about all of that. Like I said, I'm part of the team here. I am the program manager for the system navigation and the trauma-informed care project here at Vision. And we're just about to launch a novel program under a Philadelphia family support projects that will be tailored to supporting families who have children between the age of 0 and 5, and kind of helping those families navigate the system and be trauma-informed per se, but kind of reaching out to those families before they even have a diagnosis for some, as they're maybe just finding out that something might be not as they thought it would be for their child, for their loved one. So I'll talk more about the projects later on, but just wanted to put a name, I guess, with a face so you kind of know who I am and what I do here. I am also a caregiver. I have 3 children who all have autism, different level of needs, but it's the alphabet soup around this house. We have other diagnoses as well, from mild cerebral palsy to autoimmune disorder to genetic conditions and behavioral stuff and physical stuff like asthma. So our house is never, like many of your houses as well, I'm sure there's never a dull moment, right? There's always something going on. So I bring my heart to the work that I do. It's not just, it doesn't feel like work, right? When you live it and you work it per se, it just becomes, part of what I do. And I wouldn't imagine doing anything else. So as part of what I bring to the table is that personal experience, but also a lot of professional background. I've been trained in trauma care. I do a lot of work around mindfulness and supporting all people and about different needs related to just wellness and well-being in general. So here's what we're going to kind of cover for today. We're going to talk about grief and what is grief, different types of it, different stages of grief. Some of you might have heard about those before. And then we'll have a little bit of time where we'll actually take a break. But before our break, it will be kind of a meditation. So you're welcome to stay on Zoom during that time for the 10-minute meditation. Or if you need to get up and stretch, that's okay too. But that will be offered as a novel way, kind of wellness in practice, if not, I like to call it. During that time. Then we'll talk about healthy ways to cope. And then I'll share how, Vision for Equality is able to help, with things like this that we're discussing here today. Like I mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to put in the chat. I'll pause periodically throughout the presentation to allow for discussion. And after the training too, I'm willing to stay and, I can stay and we can talk more for whoever wants to stay. I'll share my contact info. You're all welcome to reach out to me later if we need, more one-on-one time as well. That's why we're here. So I love doing interactive presentations because I think that we all have something to contribute. It's not just so the person, providing, facilitating the meeting or providing the presentation, delivering the presentation that has something to contribute. All of us here know something about the topic, and I want to create a learning community if that's okay with everyone. So some of these questions are not just questions that I'm going to answer. I invite you to answer as well. So when you hear the word grief, what comes to mind for you? And you're welcome to unmute or share in the chat. And I think Victoria is also here as part of my team. So Victoria, you can help read things in the chat. That would be great.
Perfect. We have someone who said sorrow, sadness, and loss.
Mm-hmm. Those are all accurate.
Yeah, when I think of grief, I think of how it is perpetual.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it stays, it's ongoing. So it ebbs and flows, but it's always there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes people think there's like expiration date to it, but it's like, well, that was like so long ago. You should get over it. No, you can't. Grief is actually an expression of love. We grieve because we love, and we love in present time also, right? So just we think about it, grief is an expression of love. Well, love never ends. If you truly love someone, whether it's a loved one, to love something, love an experience, love a, some, a memory even, it's not, you just don't like, oh, I don't love her anymore. Often there's always feelings attached to it still, even whether that, it's that experience has passed, right? If you go away and enjoy a trip or where it's like, oh, that was so nice, where was the beach or the mountains, wherever you like to do, and then you have not been able to go back to experience that, you might be grieving that. It's like, oh, I grieve the fact that I can't do that right now. And for many of us, just having a loved ones and being caregivers does impact how we do life, right? There's things that we could do, we wanted to do, but we cannot do the way we wanted to do it, right? There's restrictions that come just with caregiving in general. And those are things that we can grieve. So it's not like I'm going to grieve it today and then tomorrow it's gone. No, I'm grieving today. Tomorrow I might feel better because I'm just coping. I'm finding new ways to enjoy life in the here and now. But then a reminder of that loss might trigger that grief again. So definitely, yeah, it's perpetual. And sometimes people say things get better with time. I like to say things get better because we get stronger. Time doesn't really heal our wounds. Is that you develop new skills, you develop new endurance, new ways to cope over time. And so that's why sometimes it feels like, things got better over time. But I think it's more what you put inside of you, your own internal endurance that gets strengthened, over time. So thank you for sharing. Is there anything else in the chat before I go to my next slide here?
Yes, we have pain, absence, loneliness, loss of a partner.
Yeah, those are all accurate. And then the other thing too, I was thinking about with loss, often for some of us who don't have pets, we don't realize that the loss of a pet can actually impact someone. I just talked with someone last week or so ago, and it was sad seeing how much they were hurting. And people would say like, well, it's just a pet. Well, for her, it was not just a pet. That was a family member, so yeah, so it looks and takes different forms and shapes, right? And there's no two griefs that are the same. So we have to, respect each other's grieving process. And we'll talk more about that later too. So I pulled off some definitions of grief from a dictionary. Yeah, someone mentioned the sorrow. Someone, it's often we think about grief as it relates to death. Someone we love has passed away, then we're grieving. That is true, but that's incomplete. There's more to grief than just that. The other one, like for Mayo Clinic, it said it's a strong and sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether their sadness stems from a loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis, they might or the loved one might be receiving. So think about it. Sometimes the person is still here. For many of us, the loved ones probably are here, but this is not the child this is not how I expected my child to be. I didn't expect to have all these diagnoses and all these health appointments and all these therapy appointments. So although a child is here, a loved one is here, we love them, we're caring for them, we might be grieving this long-term, condition that I have, the long-term process of caregiving, and then psychology today say it's a pain that accompanies loss. And that I think it's kind of sums it all. No matter what we lost, and we talk about different losses in the bed here, but it's a pain. It's acute, meaning it's a here and now. It's not always, even someone it's the past. The fact that I'm grieving makes it real and present. It could be something that I've lost 10 years ago. It could be that my loved one is 30 some years and they've been dealing with these challenges for a while. But the fact that this is still ongoing, it still feel acute. It's almost like I just cut my finger again right now in this very moment. Yeah. Jess, did you want to say something? It won't let me click on what you posted. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Well, feel free to let me know if you need anything. As a reminder, again, we shared earlier, if people just join in, if you need Spanish interpretation, please let us know in the chat, and we will let you know what will happen next. So here's how I see grief based on all the things we share here and all the things you shared. Like all of those really, are um, aligned with the definition of grief. Is that grief is a natural response to loss, natural. So if something happened and we don't grieve it, that's not healthy. And there are many ways to grieve. And sometimes, grief might take different forms that might become debilitating. And that's, we need to get help with that. But we first have to acknowledge that it's a natural thing. As I just said a few minutes ago, we grieve because we love. Grieve an expression of love. And you look at it that way. So there's no shame in loving. So there shouldn't be any shame and any guilt and any, embarrassment even, in grieving. It's an expression of love. And it can be any loss. Any loss. And your response when grief happens, it's not just that, I feel sad inside. Grief can take multiple forms. Sometimes it's a physical response, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's spiritual. We'll talk about that in a bit. Like it can impact you in so many ways. And sometimes people are not even sure that they're grieving because they're like, well, others say, well, they look fine. But you don't know what's happening inside. Right? You don't know the conversation that people are having with themselves because of what's going on.
We had someone in the chat share, Shu,
yes.
that you can grieve for others as well. And, the example they gave is hearing of catastrophic events in the news.
Yes, yes. Like right now with all the things, school shootings and everything happening overseas, like there's just so much right now. Like I personally, and I have no shame in sharing this, I don't watch the news for that same reason, that very reason. Because emotionally it becomes just too much for me. Although I do this work and I love doing this work, I also have to manage my own emotional response, right? So yeah, you can grieve for even people and things you're not even naturally connected to. I grieve for all the little girls in Ukraine, for example, the families in Ukraine are suffering, but I don't have anybody physically there that I know of, right? So yeah, grief takes on many forms. Sometimes it's close to us, sometimes it's farther away, but can still hurt just as much. So when grief happens, sometimes we think, oh, I'll just be sad, right? People, sometimes we think it should look one way, that the person who's grieving is often the person who is, crying, person who's sad. That's only one part of it. Sometimes grief will impact your appetite. I don't feel like eating. I'm not hungry because just life just feels like too heavy right now. My heart is so heavy that I lose my appetite. And sometimes people will be eating a lot. It just depends. So again, there's no one size fit all here. And it can impact all these different things we'll talk about, but it can still impact us differently. Grief is a personal experience. So like I mentioned before, grief is an expression of love. Grief is a personal experience, meaning that we can be grieving the exact same thing, but still grieve it differently. So it also impacts your sleep. Some people will sleep too much. Some people cannot sleep at all. Like they prefer to close their eyes. Sometimes people affect your energy level. Mostly people feel just so drained because you're internally, your heart is heavy. Like physically, it just drains you, like zaps all your energy. You can't do much. But I also seen people where because of grief, they become energizer bunnies. Like they're trying to do so much because they're trying to avoid the feeling. Like I don't want to be still, because if I'm still for 5 minutes or even just 5 seconds, I'm going to feel that pain. It's going to all come up and I'm trying to avoid that. So it depends, right? But our moods can fluctuate when we're going for grief. You can be teary, you can be angry, you can be sad, but definitely loneliness, right? For those of us who lost a loved one or grieving a loved one who is not, things are not where or how we expect it to be, it creates a loneliness. But when all these emotions are happening, it's also hard for your brain to focus, right? So when I mentioned that grief can impact your cognition, that's part of it. It becomes hard to focus, to make decisions. And I heard people sometimes will just say, right, I can't make another decision right now. Whether it's medical care, whether it's care at home, whether it's just too much. And that is very, very real. But also impact your social interactions. If you lost someone, and it makes it harder to be around others sometimes. But sometimes, even if you're grieving experience, let's say it's not a person, no, back to the idea of the Valentine's Day, right? When people are celebrating love, they're with the loved one. With if someone you love is not no longer here physically, but maybe they're here physically, but not close by. Maybe they're, talk to a family who the loved one is in a group home and they're not able to come home for Valentine's Day, but they used to celebrate things together. Maybe your loved one is in a nursing home and you have to work that day and can't go visit. That can really impact your interactions, right? And sometimes the reminder of seeing all the things on social media, all the things you go into. We were at the Dollar Tree with my kids. That was even before February. It's like the middle of January, or the end of January. There was all Valentine's stuff all over the place. So it's almost like you start avoiding if that becomes a painful reminder. Is very natural for people to start avoiding even going to the grocery store, avoiding going out, because it's just a reminder of all the celebration. And that reminds you that, oh, this is not how I wanted to spend this day. This is not how I expected this day to go. And that's the same for Christmas and, Thanksgiving, like those big holidays that, people celebrate together as a family. And when you're grieving, when there's losses that, that are heavy in your heart, it impacts how you interact with others and even whether or not you want to interact. I'm not going to go to the family function because when I go there, everybody's married and my spouse is not here. So there's all those things. And again, there's no shame in that. So I'm sharing all this to say, if you're feeling or these things, if you're dealing with these things, it's very natural. This is a natural human response to a pain you experience. And so there's no shame on it. So that's kind of normalize grief, right? But also sometimes grief just hits us so hard that we lose interest in just life in general. It's like I don't want to do pursue my personal interest, whether it's hobby or work or even plan for things to do later. And sometimes even on hygiene, it's like, I don't feel like getting out of bed right now. Like, who cares if I comb my hair? My loved one is never here to look at it, to see it. Now, or what I was aiming for, I didn't get. So I'm grieving that loss. And that was, I had all my energy, my focus was on that thing, whether it was a new job or a trip or a new opportunity, maybe a new business, and that didn't work out. And you feel down because of that. Sometimes that will just lead to some sadness that becomes impacting how you interact with, take care of yourself. And we talked about that thought process of like not being able to focus, but sometimes it can, for others, as grief prolongs and it's not attended to, it can still create that feeling of hopelessness. I cannot change this. This is how life will always be. And sadly, sometimes people can start having suicidal thoughts because of just the pain, the grief of it, though. And I share this, and because to say, even if someone got to that point, even if you got to that point, your loved one got to that point, there's help available. And right now, the National Suicide Prevention Line, it's a 988 number. So just like we're used to 911 for all the other emergencies, now you can actually just dial 988 and call for help. And there are trained staff on the other side of the line to support you and your loved one. And again, it's often pain that leads us to different places, mentally, emotionally, that might not always be healthy for us. It's not always intentional. So don't think your loved one is doing it because they don't care or because they're selfish. Sometimes people use those words. No, because sometimes they're just hurting too much and it becomes so hard to focus and have, be in the clear mind, if you want, to make clear decisions. And they think, well, if I'm not here, that might just stop the pain. And whoever it is, I'm just let you know that you matter, that you're here for a reason. And so I'm glad that you're here. Maybe remind your loved one that, they're needed, and definitely, reach out for help. But grief will also impact your faith. A lot of time people get angry at God or whoever it is that they believe and worship when things like this is not how it's supposed to be. You were supposed to take care of me, right? The higher power that was praying did not prevent this from happening. That again is a normal reaction. We talked about social interaction, but also your relationships. It becomes hard to trust people when something had happened to you that caused some loss that then led to the grief, grieving that loss. And I also seen especially when we lose someone, they become very fearful of losing someone else. I remember a lady who she lost a friend and from cancer, and then it was hard even for her to be at work. Like she will try to be checking on all her friends because now she was afraid that another friend will die. That's again a natural response. Again, it's because you care, it's because you love that you're grieving. I'll pause there. For all I share here, first of all, I know I'll say I experienced grief in so many levels. And so no human, no person is exempt from this, to be honest. But when you had experienced grief, and you might feel free to use the chat, have you experienced any of these, any of these challenges? Has grief impacted you in any of these ways? I'll let Victoria deal with the chat there for us.
No problem. We have some yeses. I actually put in there all of the above, especially the comfort eating and just not being able to get up.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. So you see, we're all in this, right? We're all in this boat. We might experience it differently. Might be going for a different ride, but this is a boat that's equal opportunity. No person.
I'm sorry. We have a couple more too. I experienced that fear after my eldest son was murdered 30 days after his 25th birthday in 2015. And my heart goes out to you, Yane. And then Pat said, yes, anticipatory grief. My mom had Alzheimer's. Karen said different reactions and symptoms after miscarriages and after nephew's suicide at age 17.
So this is real. We can, So for all of you, honestly, like Victoria said, our hearts go out to you. And if you need even just a safe place to just process, that's one of the things we do for the Trauma Informed Care Project. Give you a place to process, and then we connect you with some long-term support, so that you can get both peer-to-peer support, but also for clinical support as well. So often when we go through those things, that list, that previous slide, now my computer just doesn't want to go back. There we go. When we go through these things, sometimes people say, well, that looks like depression, right? Did any of you have that thought when I said, start sharing some of those, how the ways that grief impact us? And you're like, some of these make me think about depression.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. We both said yes at the same time.
It's okay.
Yeah. Yes, I have felt most of this. Typically, I lack trust in people. That is my number one. And typically, I will get angry before I will feel sad. My mood will alternate very much so. My appetite, there have been times I barely ate in about 4 days because of grief. I have grieved for the loss of my mother. That was the first major grief, which was 16 years ago. And there are times I still grieve around her birthday, around my birthday, because she passed 5 days before my birthday.
Wow.
And her funeral was the day after my birthday. On my 25th birthday, I was in Francis Funeral Home putting makeup on my mother in her casket. So I never really celebrate my birthday ever since. So that is a painful grief. Yeah. I have personal grief due to the fact I have epilepsy. And having epilepsy doesn't go away. And it caused me to get a pacemaker. So I have my mood has alternated. My focus has alternated. It has caused me to become, I would say, a very moody person. I'm trying to get better at it. I'm trying to get back to my normal self, if there's a such thing. But grief does impact us. The differences in life, I notice we have to acknowledge it.
Yes.
If we don't acknowledge it, we can't come out of it. It is harder for us. We have to realize that we're grieving. We as people, even women, mothers, we have a tendency to put on this armor that we got it. No, we don't.
Nobody has it all figured out. That's right.
Right.
We'll figure it out as we go, for sure. That's just
And that's
life's journey.
something.
Yeah.
Just because we're grieving doesn't make us weak. We're human.
Yeah.
And that's all I'll say.
Yeah. That's right on. I thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. So grief will impact us in all those ways, right? And sometimes, it's this grief that lingers because things are you're grieving it every single day. It's right there, like whether it's a condition. And I'm with you. It's like with health conditions that are chronic that doesn't go away. I grieve the health I once had, or grieve the ideal, health that I thought I should have at this age. So I totally get it. So back to that discussion about grief and depression. So some of those things looks like depression, but I just want to quickly clarify this that way, either way, I'm going to say this, either way, support is available and there's no shame in getting help. I've received help for different things with depression and grief, and I'm grateful I have not got that. But also I want to just clarify that, there's still a nuance, if you want, between the two. So with grief, usually there's a loss, that you can identify a loss. With depression, there may or may not be a loss, The other thing is like when someone's grieving, they're focusing on that loss per se. Depression, we're not focusing on the loss, we're focusing on ourselves. And it's not to say that, in a selfish way, no, but that's just how depression literally, impacts our brains. It's like you start thinking about all the things that, are not good about yourself and so forth. So that it becomes very self-centered, but not in an intentional way. But with grieving, you're actually focusing on this loss that you experience, and that becomes your focus. And sometimes, people with depression, you lose the enjoyment, if you want, that you had with things in the past. Things I used to enjoy. It's like, well, it's reading and hobby, talking to friends and doing things. It's like I don't have interest in that, and sometimes you can't even tell why, right? But with grief, it can fluctuate. Sometimes like, yeah, I'm okay. I can meet with friends and have lunch. Oh yeah, I can watch this show. And then something just like, oh, I don't have the energy for it, right? It kind of fluctuates a little bit compared to with depression. It's more like this constant loss of interest in things you once enjoyed. But physical symptom as well, like with depression, people start feeling physically ill. With grief, you might, but you might not. And sometimes you might know a little bit. It's not always. So it fluctuates. It's not always constant per se. And when people are grieving, for most people, having the closeness of others can be comforting. But with depression, usually people tend to isolate, because depression paints this picture. Sometimes people refer to the gray cloud above your head, like just like life is gloomy. I am gloomy, so I don't want to be around anybody because I don't want to be a burden. That's like that. That's the language if you want, of depression, right? So then people start isolating because they don't feel like, one, they don't fit in. They're not good enough to be with others. They don't want to be a burden. And it's different with grief. Sometimes when someone's grieving, like, well, I just need some time to grieve alone. But also when I'm around people, it's not like I'm pushing, like their presence is not making me grieve less or more, if that makes sense. And we talked about different, range of emotions, like we mentioned earlier. With depression, usually there's a lot of guilt and a lot of unexplainable, a lot of, a realistic guilt for things that didn't even happen per se. Often when someone is depressed, they'll be saying sorry about every little tiny things, even things that honestly have nothing to do with them. The other thing here with loss and grief is also that when someone is grieving, if they have guilt, it's often guilt that relates to the sense of the loss itself. They're like, oh, I wish I would have done X, Y, and Z before this loss happened. Right? If I could have done this. So they're kind of, if they have guilt, it's really tailored, honestly, towards the loss. But with depression, it's just this overwhelming feeling of just like, worthlessness that's debilitating, honestly. As someone who's been through it, again, there's no shame in getting help. So we share all this to say that these are common. It does not make you weak, like our friend shared earlier, whether it's depression, whether it's grief. It's just acknowledging, oh, my mind, my emotions might need support. Just like if I had broken my finger, or my arm, I'll run to the ER. So if I'm grieving and depressed and it becoming debilitating, it's okay to get clinical help as well. So back with self-esteem, for example, if someone is grieving, often their self-esteem is intact. It doesn't get impacted by loss, very rarely. And but if they're still thinking about death per se, it's not that, they want to not be here just for the sake of not being here. Often it's like, oh, I miss this person who passed. I wish I was with them. So if I was not here, I could be with them. With depression, it's the opposite, right? Depression, like we said, it just has gloominess, the sadness, the feelings of, worthlessness that sometimes leads people to get to suicidal thoughts. So totally different, point of reference, if you want, per se. So some of the, manifestation, if you want, might appear to be similar, but if you look at from where they stem, they're not from the same root. Does that help? Okay. Okay. Is this helpful? Oh, I think someone has their hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, everything that everybody's said, I totally agree with and sympathize and have felt. However, the last one where it's the thoughts of death. So I have a son who has an intellectual disability, his Down syndrome, and the losses that we've had, my husband and I both lost our fathers within 6 weeks of each other in the fall of 2020. And, as an adult, you realize all these things and you move on, especially if you've lost other, like I lost my mother earlier. But for him, he is all of these things. And he's away at school, and I got phone calls that he was, talking suicide. And it's scary because you don't know how he processes this grief. And, that point really hit home because he would say things like, I just want to go to heaven and give grandpa and pop a hug and then come back. So his ideas, like, you don't know what he's thinking. And he sometimes will say, I don't want to die, but I don't know that, I don't want to do anything, but I don't know that I can stop it. So it's, it's scary not being able to help that, to control.
Right. That's good that, he stirs it out loud, or some way that, others are aware of, so you can support them. It becomes even more so just scary or more dangerous when, it's just all internal and nobody knows, right? So at least when someone verbalizes it or, writes it or draws it, however they express themselves, it allows others to kind of be, there and kind of rally around them, so that one, they're not always by themselves, so that they don't have access to, lethal needs, that, they get support with, counseling, therapy as they need to. But the fact, like you're saying, that he wants to just go see them and come back, that's definitely grief, right? Because when someone is suicidal, they don't want to come back, but when someone is grieving, like he's very clearly saying, like, I want to go and just, hug them one time, right? It's that's a very grief-rooted thought there. Yeah. And I'm so sorry that you and your family are going through this.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me share.
Yeah, definitely. So I like this graphic here from Very Well. Just kind of shows, like, some of the things between grief and depression will look the same, and some won't. So you should all, I believe, Carol, everybody will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint, right? The PDF.
I'm
So
sorry.
I said everybody who registered will be able to get the copy of the PDF, right?
I'm sure they will.
Okay, and you and I can work on that then. Well, I was just saying that way, I'm not going to read for each one of this. When you get it, you can read it, but it's definitely, relates to things we've been talking about and what I went over in this previous slide here. All right. So types of loss and grief. And here, I'm sure there's many more losses than what I just came up with here. But one of the things that I think for many of us as caregivers or people with with disabilities or chronic health issues, it's kind of a loss of identity. We lose who we were or who we thought we will be, Because sometimes it's like if you're born with some condition, it's maybe, or your loved one's born with conditions, maybe not that they were in a different state per se before they appear on this earth, but just their idea or their deal even of what they, or their identity would have been, and this identity has nothing to do with gender, it's just how we see ourselves. And that, is a loss. And sometimes as we transition, go through life, different things. If I often, when people talk about the empty nest syndrome, for example, or there's a loss as identity that comes with that. I knew myself as a mother. I knew myself as a caregiver. Now they're no longer living in my home. They're moved out. I don't know who I am anymore. That's a loss of identity. Right. But also loss of safety, especially nowadays with everything going on around us. And I know, we support families in Philly, and I know some of the areas in Philly can be concerning with safety. And I mean, now it's not just Philly, but I know this, we'll hear many of you here from Philly. I can say that it's very it's scary. It's scary. I remember someone here, part of the Vision team, were just saying how even going to the store is scary now, because someone went to the store and something happened. It was just around the corner. So when we lose, what makes us, physically and emotionally safe, that's a loss. And if it's perpetual, if it's all the time and we can't control it, that loss can lead to grief as well, right? But think about loss of personal goals, like how these dreams about myself, the things I could do at this age. I was joking with a friend recently and was saying like, well, by this age, I should be doing X, Y, and Z. We're talking that we all have teenage, children. And so we're saying, we've been there at your age. We thought like, by 17, we'll do this. By the time we're ready to turn 18, we'll be moving out. Like that doesn't always happen that way, but that's a loss of personal goals. Whether it's, because we start caregiving, then we maybe had to put our own career in the background. We were starting schools, or we wanted to school and we couldn't finish, or we wanted to learn a new skill and we had to put that down. We couldn't go on a trip. I was talking to someone in the support group just this past Saturday about that. It's, how because of caregiving, it's been hard to travel as much as she wants to. That's a loss of personal goals, right? And then for many of us who require support from others, there's that loss of independence. Being able to not just physically, but even just cognitively care for ourselves. I remember myself when that was probably one of the biggest struggle for me after I had my stroke 5 years ago. It wasn't as bad, needing somebody to physically help me get into the shower. I could tolerate that more than having someone have to decide for me, like make decisions, because and that was the most frustrating part. And I had to grieve that. And so again, I was also with people who didn't really understand disability. We have to talk about that. But, and as I, as time went on, that got better. But it was, and rightfully so, even as a family member, when something happens, like a health crisis, we often will kind of all hands on deck, right? So we all come and rally around the person to support them. But sometimes we have to be careful that we are not, debilitating the person more per se. We're like, we're taking, if they really can't control the fact that the legs or arms, like for me was even my speech, I couldn't talk back then, or impacted, I really lost that. Let's not take more from them per se that they must to have control over. I would appreciate if people actually just took the time to be quiet and let me write out or type out what I wanted to say, instead of losing patience when I needed to answer and making the answer for me. And I would get so frustrated because they'll try to finish my sentences because I had really bad aphasia. And so the words wouldn't come out. And when the words came out, it wasn't always what I meant to say. And people thought they were helping, but they didn't realize that in doing it the way they were doing it, it became debilitating for me. And that loss of independence brought more grief than just the physical limitation itself. The other type of loss, I think someone mentioned here, when you're grieving for someone else, kind of secondary loss. Right? It's like you're losing someone, things happen. Things, for example, you have a loved one, right, who become disabled of an accident. And then first of all, you can be grieving for them, because of what they've been through, but also this idea where one loss can actually add to another loss. So the primary loss was for me, for example, back to that idea where the primary loss was, maybe the physical limitations. But now the secondary loss is those loss of, independence. when we start join the caregiving boat per se, you lose maybe some of your identity of things that, you know, you, maybe before, like I was known as this person, my role at work was what was most important to me. And then when I start caregiving, it's like now I have to shift that. Some of us had to leave jobs, you know, because of health issues or caregiving. And then that, you know, now I just lose my identity. I lost some of my, you know, income. You see what I mean? Like it becomes this more than just one grief or one loss, for example, on top of each other. There are different ways of looking at that. You know, you can lose one loss that brings other losses, or you can be a secondary witness if you want to someone's loss, and that also impacts you. Does this resonate with anyone? If you experience any of these, like I don't want this to be interactive, feel free to just put in the chat, you know, whatever you identify with. Like I say, I've been through all of these and probably more losses, and I'm sure you have as well. And when we share, you know, again, you share what you're comfortable sharing. It's not just to say, oh, look at this happened to them. It's more to create a community of support. Because often when we're dealing with these emotional things, it's so easy to think that, oh, it's just me. Right? I'm the only one dealing with this. So when others share, when I invite you to share, it's to create that safety for all of us. To realize, one, whoever, you know, is sharing is not alone, or whoever didn't even share is not alone. You can see, oh, others are dealing with this too. This is very natural.
We have some really good comments. One says, when your children go off to college, you can feel that we've lost our purpose. Another comment was, that's something I emphasize for my son, is to give him a moment to speak for himself instead of jumping in to answer for him. And another comment was, watching your parents fade away due to dementia, especially when they realize their child is now their parent caring for them.
Yeah. That's hard. Yeah. And like in that last example, that just thinking about all the different losses that piles up, right? So for them, they probably lost some of their identity as a parent, right? And lost some independence, and probably lost some personal goals that they still probably want to pursue. And then as the child and you're caring for them, that, you know, that shifting of roles, right, impacts you also. You probably, and I had a friend who had kind of witnessed that with, you know, with a friend, and there was days where she wished it was someone else because she wanted to run to mom and say, Mom, this is what I'm dealing with. But she couldn't come and say, Mom, this is what I'm dealing with, because this is Mom, the one who had the dementia. And so it becomes hard. Like, you know, like you, if your mom was your confidant or dad, you know, used to confiding them and be able to get their support. It's like you couldn't run to them and get support because they needed your support. And because of where they are with that, you know, with the condition, they can't, you know, always understand what it is that, you know, you are sharing. So that adds more grief to on top of it. Yeah. So like we talked about those losses. So usually, remember, our definition of grief was it's a response, right? It's a pain that we experience after a loss. So I wanted to do some of the losses for just example, to see that you have to usually have a loss before you start grieving. So the loss will happen. It's usually something that's, you know, outside of your control, something that, you know, it's external, that then creates this internal reaction, which is the grief. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when the grief comes, grief can also look at different ways. I think someone mentioned anticipatory grief, like exactly that. You know, it's what I often call like grieving ahead. You know, people will be like, well, the person's still here. Why are you grieving? Well, because I see the end coming and I don't like it. And you don't have to like it. So that's not to say that's a bad thing. No, you don't have to like it. And most of us in your shoes will not like it either. Right. And but it's not always grieving someone who's who's dealing with a health condition, or sometimes like things like cancer where they give like, oh, you have 2 months to live. And I'm not a medical doctor, so please, no offense to any medical doctor here, but from kind of the trauma perspective, I'm like, why tell people that? I know that they have to give people sort of prognosis, right? Like, you know, this is what we're looking at. But I also feel like sometimes knowing that it's more for some people, you know, I'm not saying this for everyone. Again, there's no one size fit all, but I've seen and experienced, and there's a lot of research also showing that when we get bad news, people get stuck there, and that's just how our brains are wired. Unless we're intentional about getting ourselves out of that bubble, we get stuck there and we stop living even before the time comes. So people who know that, yes, it's hard. Yes, you know, they're going down, you know, things are going down. It might not be a long time, but people who look at it from a different perspective, like, I'm going to make the best of the time we have together. are actually able to enjoy those last moments or last years, last months more than people like, oh, this is the end, now we're done. So again, it goes a lot with how we, how we view it. But you can also be grieving, like someone mentioned about college, right? My oldest one, sorry, is going to be 17. As right now, she's not planning to leave the house yet. When she turns 18 to go to college, so do college from home. But that could be something I can just anticipating the fact that she will be leaving the house. I can start grieving, right? And that is also normal. It's like the loss is not here yet, but I'm seeing that loss is going to come. And we were joking with my daughter earlier. We have a car right now that again needs, has issue. Now it's like a brake leak. I'm like, as much as we keep holding on to this vehicle, I'm starting already this process of anticipatory grief, because like one day it's just gonna give out and we can't fix anything else about it. Right? It's just a car, but it's gonna be a loss, right? And then the next type of loss here is this disenfranchised grief, where it happens after loss that others don't see as valid. And often this happens with suicide, where people don't even put on, do an obituary for public one, for example, or the funeral is just the family members, and this is not to shame anyone. This is again because of the stigma that nationally, internationally, the society at large had put around mental health. Right. And so then people don't see as valid. They're like, well, the person did it to themselves. No, they were not well. And that's what happened. Right. But sometimes it's that, like, you're grieving something that people don't think it's a real loss. I can think of, a few things, like when you're older and you hear a teenager grieving a breakup, you're like, come on, there's more guys, more girls, more people ahead. Right. Because like, you've been there, done that, life will go on. But for them in that moment, that's all they can think of. And rightfully so. That's where they are on their journey, right? So that could be a disenfranchised grief, where for the rest of the public, the rest of the family, it's like, it's no big deal. You didn't pass the test. Come on, you'll be fine. But for them, it's like, it's so hard. Right? But this again, and if you want to call to action for all of us, a reminder even that we all grieve differently. There's no big grief and little grief. There's no grief that's important and grief that's not important, because that's still, again, your own reaction to the loss that you experienced, the pain that you're experiencing because of a loss, and you're grieving. I'll say it one more time. You're going to hear me say it many times, because you love, right? So whether it was a test, because that test meant a lot to you. You love your study so much, you love your career so much that not getting that, passing that test, that has that much impact in your life. And that's not something to be ashamed of, right? Well, abbreviated grief is when grief is short-lived, and sometimes it's not always intentional. I can think of someone who literally would, their dad died, and then it was right during COVID, and they had to go right back to work. And this person was from Indian background, so culturally, there's a whole process that they grieve. And from someone from Africa, I can totally relate to what she was saying. She's like, I didn't have time to grieve because she didn't get the time that she needed. Because sometimes, the bereavement, the period everyone from work, some places 2-3 days. So sometimes, like if you get 7 days, right, depending on what job you are. Again, this is not to shame any employers. It's just to say this is the reality that people live in. And so when those things happen, it's like, oh, my grief was shortened. And then people suppress all these emotions. They don't get to grieve the way that they needed to grieve in order to be able to move forward with life. And sometimes grief can become chronic or complicated. And so when it happened, it's like when grief it's there, it doesn't get better quickly. We talked about grief will look different for all of us. Often over time, we still will, acknowledge the grief and deal with it, but we're able to function. So grief that lingers, and then, that it gets in a way of us going through our day-to-day life, is kind of what we call that chronic and complicated grief. And again, it's no shame on getting help. Absent grief is when someone might feel like they're not grieving. They'll be the one making all the arrangements, right? They'll call the funeral home, for example. They're taking care of all the bills and things at home, and taking care of the belongings that needs to go wherever they need to be. Like they're just so busy taking care of everything else. People might appear that they're not grieving. Sometimes that's how people cope. And so it's not, again, not shaming anyone. So if you see someone grieving like that, it's like, my goodness, I've never seen them shed a tear. It's not, it doesn't mean that they're not grieving. It might appear absent to the rest of us, but they might be fully grieving internally. And we have to give them that dignity, if you want, to grieve the way that they want to grieve. And traumatic grief is when grief happens after a traumatic event. So sometimes it's something you didn't plan for. It's like, it's so sudden that literally just shocks all of you, whether it's a car accident, whether it's a heart attack, things like that. For me, it was a stroke. Went to a procedure. Nobody thought anything else. Like, it was an outpatient thing. You go and come home. And then I went and they come home a month later and still have lingering effect, right? That was traumatic. And so not only, you grieve the event itself that happened, but then you grieve the losses that happen afterward as a result of that. That's what we call traumatic grief. All right, Marisol, go ahead. I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I think in my case too, like with my daughter, when the doctor told me last year, like they had to remove her eye. For me, that was terrible and my husband had a heart attack in the same week. So it was terrible because thinking in the future of my daughter, because she don't talk, she's nonverbal, and the only way she really enjoy life is watching videos and stuff. And when the doctor told me they had to remove the eye, I quickly, my brain started running because I know I'm looking at the future. I say, oh my God, what I got to do? So it was really hard. So I now seeing this scale, I see, okay, that is a traumatic grief because really was traumatic. Had 2 episodes in the same week. Like, was really terrible. And I still grieving about that.
Yeah. And rightfully so. There's no expiration date to grief. And sometimes we tell people, like I said earlier, oh, that was a year ago, that was 10 years ago. It doesn't matter how long it was. I'm still grieving because I love these people. I love whatever it is that happened. That loss was so great because I love something about that person, that situation, that experience, that I'm still grieving. And it's okay to honor that. And I'm so sorry. That's a lot at once. There's a lot at once. And I'm sure then you're taking care of your husband, taking care of your daughter, making all the decisions on top of that. So when you're grieving and then you're never given, not because of the doctor per se, just the situation, the way these things play out, right? So you're grieving as a mother, as a spouse, and then now you have to make decisions for the same things for which you're grieving. It's like even your brain gets disheveled, right? It's like which side of the brain, like you can't activate, your thinking brain, if per se, when your emotions are all, overwhelmed. Yeah, Yanya, go ahead. See, you raised your hand too.
Hi, yes, I wanted to I guess I resonated somewhat with what for me appeared to be abbreviated grief, or absent grief, when my son passed away, because it was almost like I felt like I couldn't grieve because I had Christopher, who, even though with his ID, people said, like he wouldn't understand. He did understand in his own way. Like, no one ever told him when it all happened that his brother passed away, but he's 5 years apart. Chris is a twin, and my eldest was 5 years older. And I would always joke and say, like, Stephen is his twin, but Malcolm is his person. So, and I'm okay. I'm just like,
no, it's okay.
Emotional. So, but I remember when I was afraid. I didn't know whether or not to send him to school. And I had let the school know because he was at Widener. And they were so supportive. And I never forget, she was just like, we got him. And he went to school the first day and he was fine. And then the next day, it was almost like Chris was like moaning, like he was in pain. And his bedroom is right next to mine. And that night he was in the bed and he just kept saying, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He said, "I'm sorry, Malcolm." And it just kind of went through me, but I kept feeling like I have to comfort Chris. His twin brother, he was in his first semester of college, and all of this happened like 1 week before his finals. So I did ask him, did he want to finish, or did he want to, get an excuse to close out, to get like a withdrawal or an excuse.
Right.
And he wanted to finish. He said he wanted to finish, but I was just so like, it took everything in me. He was just like, "Mom, do not come up to my school." Like, it took everything in me. I just wanted to like gather his professors and walk into his classroom and make sure that he was fine, but I couldn't. But I was trying to support them. My parents are divorced. My father is Muslim. The funeral was at a church. He was upset because we couldn't have the imam even, like, I guess he wanted him to say a prayer, but you can't say a prayer in someone's church. And then he just wanted him to give remarks, and we couldn't do that. So it was almost like I was trying to manage everyone's feelings. I didn't have space to grieve. Then I went back to work. It happened in November 30th. I went back to work January 4th or 6th, whatever that Monday was. And it was just like, it took me probably about like a year and a half before I guess I just like kind of crashed, for lack of a better term. Because I had started a new job, which I took a demotion so I could go back to college, not knowing all of this was going to happen. And I had to go back to college, or I didn't have any more, like when you put your loans off. So I had to go back to school or start paying my loans. And I had just taken a demotion, so I had to go back to school. And so I went back to school that May. And from the outside looking in, it looked amazing that I was working, I was back in school. And then I just got to a point where I couldn't focus, I couldn't think. And it was like, my hair started falling out. And I just had to learn that either I was going to have to deal with my grief, or my grief was going to deal with me. But it was just for me, it was just such a slow, sneaky feeling or process for me, because a part of me felt like, oh, I'm going to be okay. Oh, I'm dealing with this. Oh, I'm exercising. And for me, I didn't want to sit with my thoughts. And so I wanted to like wear myself out and be busy and exercise. I got a personal trainer. And I just wanted to fill myself so I didn't have time to sit with my thoughts. And that only works up to a certain point. And then I just had to stop and admit some things and just deal with it. But I think from the outside, it looked like I wasn't grieving. But I was in my own way, but I just felt like I couldn't grieve because so many people in my family were looking to me. And like, I'm the oldest granddaughter. I'm the house where everybody has Christmas. So it was like they were still looking for me to like kind of be the foundation for them to be okay. And then I just felt alone. So a lot of this did resonate with me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And again, I'm sorry that you had to experience that. You brings a good point there. That's the reality for a lot of us caregivers, whether it's someone who passed away or not. It's because everybody needs us. We don't have time to breathe and even acknowledge that we are stressed as well. Even put grief aside, right? It's just the role of a caregiver, often it's, it has its own load of stress, and because everybody depends on us, we can't take that caregiver hat, for a second sometime and just say, I'm human, I'm hurting, I'm tired.
I even said that at some point. I felt like I don't have time to think about myself. I have to take care of my family. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Anything else in the chat there, Victoria, before we move to the next section?
I think we've pretty much covered everything. There was one other comment that was made talking about how extended family members, have mentioned that they feel like they've lost extended family because of deep political differences. And they feel caught in the middle, even though these relatives are still living, they feel like they've lost them.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That reminds me too, during just the beginning of COVID, right? Families were pulled apart because of whether or not they're going to wear masks during the holiday. I remember a friend from my church was saying, well, we're not sure where we're going to go, what we're going to do for holidays, because people are so busy fighting over mask and vaccination and so forth, and that it actually felt like they lost family because they couldn't celebrate the way they used to, and so COVID alone for all of us, is a big loss, and we all have to grieve all the changes of routine, changes of, so many things. And like my son was saying, are we going to wear this mask forever? I'm like, I'm sorry, buddy. Like, yeah, it's like for them, it was like the past 3 years, that's what we've been doing now. So it's like, this is just what we do, and yeah, thank you for sharing that. So stages of grief, like I'm sure probably most of us have heard of these. Is the stage of grief new to anyone here? Have you heard of those before? I'll still kind of go through them a little bit here, but I want to see how much we have to dive into it or not. But Kubler-Ross was the one who kind of came up with this model, and over time, people have added to it. So sometimes if you Google stage of grief, you'll see sometimes 6 stages and 7 stages, and it's sometimes when I look at it, it's like some of them will overlap with what she already proposed years and years and years, decades ago. So I like sticking with what she suggested. So usually like there's denial, where it's like, I don't believe this is actually happening, right? This can't be happening. Like, somebody pinched me. I'm in a dream. Like, I don't want to I want to wake up to reality. And sometimes there's anger, where like, I'm just so angry this happened. I'm mad at someone. And, and sometimes the anger leads to this bargaining, where it's almost like you're trying to bargain with yourself, right? If I had done this, if this did not happen, I would have tweaked here and there, this, maybe I could have prevented this. And sometimes one of the stages of grief that people talk about, they'll call it guilt and add it under the bargaining. But for me, I think that guilt and bargaining kind of go together, because often I start feeling guilty, therefore I want to bargain with what I could have changed or done differently. Kind of that remorse that comes after, and I'm trying to fix the situation. Then there's that depression, where just like we talked about those symptoms before, where I'm just hopeless, that I don't know what the future will look like. This, it shouldn't happen. Now that it happened, it's going to impact my life forever. I'm not going to be the same person. And we just kind of, we kind of go internally, emotionally, we feel down. And again, that is totally, totally normal. Another stage is just acceptance. And more often people hear acceptance like, well, isn't that kind of cruel to tell people just accept it? That's not how it's supposed to be. When we say acceptance, you're still going to acknowledge that the loss happened. You're still going to acknowledge that you're grieving that loss. But then you're going to make the conscious decision to move forward with life. I don't really like when people say, I'm going to move on, like you're going to leave that behind. No, you're moving forward with this new experience. Right? I like to look at it from this point, like whether it takes a loved one that, like I said earlier, we can grieve the children we have, the loved ones that we have who have conditions that we didn't expect, right? And accepting that might look like, this is not what I wanted for my loved one. This has impacted all of us, in time and energy and health and money, probably, and so many things, relationships. But this is where we are. And this I cannot control. Right? But then I'm going to choose to embrace what this is now it's part of my life. I can't just act like it didn't happen, right? This is part of my life. I'm going to move forward with it. And all of us here as caregivers, that's probably what we did and are still doing. That's why we're still here and why we're even here on this Zoom call tonight, right? Because we acknowledge that this is our lives. And some people tell me, like, your kids will get older, things will change. And I'm like, these people don't get it. It's like, but kids will get older, things will change, autism will still be present. Life might change, might look different, but some of the challenges will just get bigger or maybe smaller or maybe look differently. But we can't just snap out of autism. We can't snap out of, IDD. These are things for us. These are things that we deal with every single day. So them being 18 or 36 or 6 does not make a difference, right? For many of us, there's always going to, we realize they're going to need that support. And so acceptance is kind of like realizing, yes, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. And sometimes I tell caregiver, it's okay to acknowledge that. This is not what I signed up for, but here we are. And we're going to keep living. We're going to make the best of lives. And we're going to, all of us, for ourselves as caregivers and our loved one, choose to have an everyday life, right? But it's so with that conscious decision first. And what I want to share here, were there any comments in the chat? Sorry, I don't want to go farther. Are these, kind of familiar? Does that make sense? Does that resonate with anyone? Before
we have a comment that says, after watching a loved one experience a long, painful death and then they are gone, you feel almost relieved that it's over for them and for yourself. And then you feel guilty about feeling relief.
Yes. Thank you guys for sharing. Like, I'm so proud of you. I love this interaction because this normalizes grief, right? These are things that people often don't say out loud. I remember a lady from our church, and not to get too personal, but her husband had a stroke after a brain surgery because he had a tumor. We were actually in the same rehabilitation hospital. We actually were first in the same hospital and then the first rehabilitation clinic, the same rehabilitation clinic. I'm here living, he passed away. And she even told me, she's like, these are things I can't tell anybody. I've seen him for years, like just go downhill. He was an engineer doing like back to loss of identity, right? He was doing a soil engineer, which I didn't even know there was such a thing, but he was studying soil and they just loved to do that and couldn't do that anymore. And then after the brain injury, he couldn't, he needed help 24/7. And so she saw him just kind of like, quote unquote, I'm using her term, deteriorate throughout the couple of years that he was alive. And it's almost like when he was not here, he was like, at least now he's not hurting. But those are things like you mentioned, she couldn't say out loud. People were like, well, how can you say that about your husband? Like, you should be grieving your husband. But it was almost that relief that, okay, now he's not hurting. Now I don't have to look at him suffer so much. But then also that guilt, like, I can't say this out loud because nobody will understand unless they've been in my shoes. Right.
Yeah. And we have another comment that says, and then there are mixed stages. Like last year, my husband's cousin's married son passed away suddenly, but his wife was expecting. So almost 8 months later, the baby was born, and that brought joy and yet fresh sorrow over the loss.
Yeah. Something I signed up for. I'm not sure what. Oh, yeah. Has
Carol,
to do with grief. Hold on a second.
Carol, can you mind me mute everyone, please? Since we're recording.
Yeah, I'll call you later. I'm not doing anything.
All right. Nope.
Okay, because I honestly don't know how to stop. But it's really.
Do you get them? Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. And Carol, feel free to make Victoria a co-host too, that she can also help us with chat. I know life happened again. This is no apologies needed. This is life, right? Life is happening while we're doing this. And so if you need to take care of something, that's totally fine. We're just muting so that again, that when since we're recording, then recording is clear and people can hear the discussion here and the training per se. So when people hear about stages of grief, they think like, oh yeah, I'll go from denial and then I go to anger and then depression and bargain and then acceptance, like hooray, life goes on. No, this is what grief looks like on this side. It's like mumbo jumbo, up and down. You can actually have the go through the acceptance, like I'm fine, I agree, I approve this, like not approve this, like I accept what's going on. And then the very next day, like, you know, the very next hour, you go for another doctor appointment, like, this cannot be happening to us. I'm so mad. And no diagnosis, no medicine. That's my own story yesterday, you know, it's like, it did happen. So remembering that grief is not linear. It's not a straight line that we just go through and like, and then we check the box that I grieved my loss and now I'm fine. No, grief is a journey. So yes, there are stages per se, but you know, I use the term stage because that's, you know, that's how it was introduced to the world per se. But I don't like the stage because stage makes you think almost like, you know, you're going up the stages, right? It doesn't give you the sense of like the whole up and down, you know, side and above and behind. You know, it's just like that's actually real life. You know, grief is an experience, and some days we you know, it seems like we, you know, we got it. Some moments even it's like, I can't deal with this, it's too much. And both are very valid. Very valid. Has anyone experienced like when you're dealing, you know, grieving the loss where just mixed emotions, right? In one sense, I think that what our friend was sharing earlier, like I'm relieved that, you know, they're not grieving, they're not suffering, not hurting, and then like, oh, I'm guilty for this, like, you know. And so yeah, you can have more than one emotion at the same time. And I think in general, not just around grief, because we don't always spend a lot of time. I mean, things are changing, and you know, there's more awareness, more education around these things. But definitely, our mental health is not as talked as much or as, you know, attended to as much as our physical health, right? So when it comes to emotions, many of us think that we can't have conflicting emotions at the same time, which is not true. So we spend a lot of time numbing the emotion that's less comfortable. You know, I don't like saying, you know, bad emotions and good emotions because they're all emotions, just how you're feeling at that moment. So it doesn't, you know, it does no bad or good. It's just some of them are more comfortable than others. You know, joy feels comfortable, you know, excitement feels comfortable, but anger and frustration does not feel comfortable, right? So it's not bad, it's just not comfortable. And what you do with it, you know, is, you know, you might take an action or not take an action that's not healthy and not doesn't benefit you. But the emotion itself, there's nothing wrong with it. And you can have both. I can be happy that I get to do this for a living, that I can be and support families and, you know, families like mine. But I can also be, excuse my French, pissed that I have 3 kids with disabilities. The two can coexist. It does not make one wrong or, you know, or one less valid than the other. So the more we acknowledge our own emotions, the more the healthier we grieve, if that makes sense. It's just giving us, so we'll talk about that, so giving yourself permission to actually feel those emotions. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
When my mother passed away after years of dementia, my sister-in-law and my husband had lost their mother to cancer. So she said to me, now you can grieve the mother that you remember. And that just really resonated with me. It's like, because you're watching this and it's anticipatory, and, you know, every phone call, you're like, oh, is this it? So you're grieving all along. And I've said that, you know, about grandparents that I've watched, that, you know, that one, you're never ready for it, even though you're watching it. But when it happens, then that grief almost stops. And then you do remember, like, it was almost harder for me years after I lost my mother, because then you just remember the good time, you know, like you're when you're in the moment, all those years, it's just, you know, sad and dark, and you're, you know, every moment it's like, is this it? Is it? But then afterwards, it's like, yeah, like I want to call her up and say, hey, can you tell me how to make that, you know?
And then like, I can't.
Yeah,
definitely. And then, you know, so mention like anniversaries, you know, birthdays, it's like, oh, they're not here to celebrate with us, you know, those reminders then that they're not there becomes even, you know, kind of more of a trigger, if you want, you know, towards that grief. Yeah, and we'll talk about a little towards the end here about ways we can still remember and celebrate our loved ones, and even celebrate the things that, you know, we have lost, and acknowledge that as a way for us to grieve in healthy ways. So we're going to do the meditation now. Feel free to stretch if you need to. What I often do when I do this, I'll turn my camera off. I'm still here. and it'll go for 10 minutes. It's a little break. If you need to grab something to drink, that's fine. Take care of yourself as well. But those of us who are able to stay, and even if it's playing in the background, this is one of the, I love this one because it allows you to kind of process, but in a healthy way, and have more compassion towards yourself as you're grieving. So I want you to know, it's guided, so it'll take you through different things, but think about this is not just grief of a loved one who died. This would be any losses that you experience that, that might be still, hurting and that you need to process. So I'm going to hit this. Let me know, Victoria or Carol, if the sound is okay. And then hopefully it plays here. Okay.
Yes, the sound's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can hear it.
All right, I'll close my camera. Oh, they need to turn it off.
So I would like to invite you to put down whatever might be in your hand. And to find a position that's comfortable and also that supports you. And listen to my words, and if they are resonant for you, if they are helpful, really let them enter into your experience. And also bring your own experience and your own language to what is being pointed to as we touch into this meditation on grief. And beginning with remembering really why you're here. And bring your attention to the breath for just a moment. And let the breath sweep your mind. And notice whether it's a deep breath or shallow. And recall for a moment now a loss or losses that have really touched you. Or the anticipation of loss. And I'll offer some simple phrases that we can touch into around the truth of grief. May I be open to the pain of grief. Notice whatever comes up, not rejecting it, not clinging to it. May I be open to the sorrow, to the pain of grief. May I find the inner resources to really be present for my sorrow. May I find the inner resources to really be present for my sorrow. And notice any judgment or resistance that arises. It'll pass. May I accept my sadness, knowing that I am not my sadness. May I accept my sadness, knowing that I am not my sadness. And if you've cared for someone and felt like it wasn't always so easy, reflect on this phrase. May I forgive myself for not meeting my loved one's needs. May I forgive myself for not always being able to meet my loved one's needs. And may I forgive myself for mistakes made and things left undone. So true of all of our life. May I forgive myself for mistakes made and things left undone. May I be open with others and with myself about my experience of loss. May I be open to receive the kindness of others as they support me in this journey of grief. And completing this brief exploration of grief, may I and all beings learn from and transform sorrow. May I and all beings learn from and transform sorrow. Again, noticing whatever is arising for you, whatever thoughts are present, not clinging to them. Whatever you're feeling in your heart, how the body feels. as you consider the possibility that grief can be a profoundly humanizing experience and bring greater depth into our lives.
I see everyone feeling, I feel almost guilty, kind of have to bring you back from that moment. I feel so relaxed right now. Was that helpful?
I think that was really beautiful, actually.
Yeah, once you get the PDF, the link will be there. I was trying to see if I can, oh, nope, it won't let me do it. I was trying to see if I could copy the link and put in the chat, but technology is not my friend right now. Yeah. So once you get this, you know, the link, you can use that anytime for yourself, for, you know, with your loved one. And just that's one healthy way to cope, right? It's kind of acknowledging those things we couldn't change, things we wish would have changed, things that were hard. And yeah, sometimes we will talk about journaling a little bit, but sometimes for me, one of the things that help me sometimes is journal about those things. So like I can do meditation like this, but then take the time to even dig deeper, you know, how I truly feel about those losses, about the things that I cannot do, or things I wish I could have done. Something in the chat. You've seen the numbers go up, so I'll make sure I'm not missing anything.
Nope.
Okay.
I mean, Karen did say it was very helpful for her as well, and she said thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so let's jump into the next section here about healthy coping strategies. We talk about grief, talk about what griefs look like, how it could be, you know, similar or somewhat different to depression. We talk about different losses, different stages, right? And now we look like what we do about all of this, right? So all those things are good. That's kind of the foundation of kind of background stuff, right? Now it's like, okay, now we have to move with real life shoe. What do I do with all of this? So we learn ways to cope with it because we can't always change it, right? You can't go back and bring someone back to life, or we can't undo a loss that we experience, or sometimes the loneliness, for example. Maybe you're like, I didn't lose anything, nobody, but I just feel lonely right now, you know, and sometimes it's hard to change that as well. And so we'll talk about some healthy coping strategies that we can implement per se. But first, I'm going to ask a question, and feel free to unmute or use the chat. How do you usually cope with grief, loss, and or loneliness? Like, what has helped you? You feel free to, you know, put one thing. It doesn't have to be a full sentence. Just going to put one word in the chat. That's fine too. Let's get as many one words as possible. That'll be good. Kind of build, you know, again, as you're learning community, as you're sharing, somebody else can learn from it, myself included. Usually when I do these things, I always go back, you know, leave with something new that I can implement. Yeah, I see that chat going up. Go ahead, Victoria.
Journal.
Yeah.
Color, knit.
Awesome.
Coloring is very relaxing for me too, actually.
See, sometimes those things that, I mean, now over the years, I've seen coloring come back for adults too. Right now we have adult coloring books, but, you know, often things that we used to do when we were younger that was soothing and calming. Many of us don't do those things when we're older because, like, I'm too old for that, right? You're not too old for that. If it's healthy and helps, you know, who kind of ground yourself and helps you deal with life, then it's a healthy coping skill, you know, and there's no age limit to it. So whether it's coloring, whether it's no playing, yeah, there's actually a lot of reasons. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say we have some really good comments. Making space and time for my feelings, taking time from work, agreeing with coloring, babies, music. Someone said signing up for these Zooms,
Yes.
going to events at church and the library events too. double Dutch dance breaks with my grandson. So we're getting lots of great ideas.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. In our house, we still do, but just not as much on a regular basis for us. We used to have Friday night dances, and it was my way of breaking my loneliness. Like, my kids have more energy than I do. And then it's like, hey, Friday night, I'm stuck at home, we'll play, we'll do something with my family. And it just, it was nice. And that's actually how I coped with my divorce. It was finding something to do, on the weekend, that when I was away from work, when the loneliness like really, crept up, like I could fill my cup in different healthy ways. And so, yeah, all of the things you mentioned are really good. And I kind of have them. Oh, I see more stuff. Feel free to read there, and then we'll go into the next slide.
Someone agreed with the double Dutch.
See, I'm not
said they used
like
to be in the
that. I'll end up on the
competition.
floor.
I know, me too. Someone else said listening to calming music and baking more.
Yes, yes, beautiful. Beautiful. You bake and you can send some baked goods this way.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go for it.
The person that said double Dutch, oh, let me tell you how much I used to love double Dutch. Oh my God. I thought no one ever does that anymore.
There you go.
I used to do tricks and everything. Like, I loved it so much. But now I'm 49 and like almost 3 months and a half, I had got one knee replacement, and now in May I'm going for a second one. So I don't think I could be able to do double Dutch anymore, but I love double Dutch. There you go, girl.
Yeah, so definitely there's no, and I know like with health, health situations, like, yeah, sometimes we get, there's things where it might be a challenge to do, but if there's something that you used to love and you can still do it, go for it. I can I can't even say the word, but whether it just, even just jump rope. It's whatever you need to do that we used to be enjoying. Like, I remember even nowadays, like if I can just allow myself to be on the ground, most of the time I have to get someone to help me to get up later, but be on the ground with my kids at the park and actually, just draw a chalk on the ground, like the sensory experience of it, and just so calming. But that's not something that most adults will think to do on their own, right? So, but if it helps, there's many ways. So I'm gonna with healthy coping strategies, there's many of them. And those of you who know me know that I love to organize things a certain way because my own brain needs organization. So I kind of put them in different categories per se, but as a way to also remind ourselves to give ourselves permission to experience grief. Right? If we had a loss, grief is there. Numbing, I think Yanni's the one saying it, like, if we numb it and pretend it's not there, it's going to catch up with us somehow. I often say our emotions are almost like a sponge, and I meant to bring a sponge and I did not. But think about it, if you have a sponge, those of us use sponges to do dishes, for example. If you have a sponge, you're down at the sink and you put that sponge under the faucet there, it gets really wet and soggy. What will happen if you don't squeeze that water out? Like, if it just happened, it's soaked with water, and you just take that sponge and you go to your living room and then go to your bedroom, and then maybe you're back in the bathroom, what will happen? And anybody's welcome to chime in.
It just you just trail water wherever you go.
Exactly. So our emotions are the same way. If we don't give ourselves permission to squeeze the water out of that sponge, we'll be dripping everywhere we go. And sometimes we drip in places and spaces that we don't want to drip. Okay. I don't want to come to work and just lose it emotionally. But if I give myself permission to go and drip in my bathroom, what I need to is space in the corner of my own house and let those tears come out when they come out, I might be able to deal better with my loved one, right? I might have a little calmer and be, not so short and not so irritable with my son, because once for the 20th time, he makes soap and lotion or pour my milk down the drain, But if I took the moment to deal with that emotion, then I can address the life. I don't have to drip my anger, my frustration on everybody and everywhere. So I mean, yeah, someone was going to say something. I'm sorry that I kind of interrupted there.
Well, we had a comment that says looking at photos helps too, even when it is making those collages for a loved one's funeral, as I had not expected to have to do for 2 family members within 2 months.
Wow. Yeah, that's hard. Yeah. there's actually, phototherapy, there's a better word for it, but the idea is that, you collect pictures of things that bring you joy. And personal story, that was part of how I got out of depression. Some 15 years ago, I was so depressed, I couldn't find beauty in anything. Life was doomed. I felt I was doomed. And so my therapist back then said, hey, what if you just be more mindful? Like, try to notice some beautiful things around you. And up to this day, I still have I actually printed those pictures and have them in the photo album. I still have those pictures. I'll find a butterfly somewhere at the park. I'll find, flowers somewhere. Something was rain. Something was a bunny. We live in Pia where there are just critters everywhere. So I've got pictures of a lot of critters, but it was things that were always there. And in that moment where I couldn't find beauty in my own life, I was able to find it in nature. And for me, nature is one of the most therapeutic things that always fill my cup. When I feel overwhelmed, I need to go away. Like even just to drive to the park, and I live in the South Central Pier where there's a lot of, parks and, and creeks and things like that. So sometimes just sitting there and watching the water, sitting there looking at trees, just calms me, and you listen to the birds. So very good. Thanks for sharing that. So if you can't get physically with something that brings you joy, collect pictures of it. If you look like me, you like the beach and you can't go to the beach, watching videos of beaches, or having that in the background, just even nature sounds on all these apps we have on the phones, right? And that alone can also help you just kind of, calm yourself. So the first permission that I would encourage you to give yourself is permission to feel and release your emotions. Sometimes the only way out is through. Like the analogy with the sponges. If you don't squeeze those emotions out in healthy ways, you're going to keep dripping everywhere. So here are some suggestions of how you can, feel and release those emotions. So journaling is one of them. And sometimes and rightfully so, I hear a loved one will say, well, my loved one cannot draw, or they cannot write, how can they journal? I say, well, there's many ways to journal. Sometimes, if someone can speak, they can use their voice to record an audio journal, and sometimes it's visual, like we talked about. I remember a young man who was had an autism diagnosis, was nonverbal, but he loved taking pictures. So every day he took pictures of things that brought him joy in his phone, like just for things he did, like just as a way for him to journal. At the end of the day, you use a collage app on his phone. I can't remember what it was, but then he'll just put those pictures together, and that was his journal entry for the day. And so imagine even little things like that, we can help our loved ones, as a way for them to process things that are happening around them. And sometimes people say, well, I'm not even sure how to journal. Like, where do I start? Well, how about how you're feeling? What do you miss the most when we talk about these losses, right? What hurts the most? And what do you need to have closure? That's often one of the big things with traumatic grief, for example. Things happen so suddenly that there's so many things left undone, unsaid. And so that could be, a journal entry right there. This is what I need for closure. This is what I wish I could have said to them. This is what I wish I could have still be so done with them before that moment happened. And if it's a loss of identity, for example, it's okay to see what the things I missed the most about that role I had, that job that I had. And here's the things that I wish I could still do if X, Y, and Z did not happen. It's actually healthy. And as a caregiver to caregiver, I give you this permission to even journal. Here are the things I would have done if I was not a caregiver. Because if that's something that, that's sitting in your heart, that's heavy in your heart, you need to be able to release that. But I also encourage you, after you process that, also look at, for many of us, our life been enriched and blessed because of the challenges that we have. I wouldn't be doing this and loving this so much. I don't love the fact that we all have loss and grief and grieving those losses. I love the fact that now I don't have to grieve alone. You don't have to grieve alone, that we can all be here learning about this. But if I didn't go through the things that I've been through, I wouldn't be doing the things I do today. If I didn't have kids with disability, I wouldn't qualify for the job that I have today. Let's be real, right? And so it's not just, and so it's looking at the cup, not always half empty, but also half full. And those are all things you can journal about. And that actually helps you even with the process of grieving. And art also, all of these are actually evidence-based, things. There's a lot of science behind it, that, research behind it that prove these things help. And art can look different ways, with painting, coloring, pottery, and clay. anything, sometimes just sensory of the fact to be able to touch something reminds you that you're here. Actually, I don't want to get all clinical, but like in counseling, when people start to dissociate, meaning that, the physical here, but the mind is elsewhere. One of the exercise that helps is actually to do some mindful exercise, like the 5-4, kind of use your 5 senses to get in touch with reality. So sometimes something I see, something I smell, something I can taste, something I can hear, something I can touch. So that's clay, for example, it's a good way to even, use all those 5 senses, because you're seeing what's in front of you, whether it's the clay or what you're trying to make, you're touching that clay, you're smelling that clay, whoever else is around it, right? And so there's different activities you can do that actually help you engage all your senses, and it reminds you to be here and now in the midst of all the grief that you're dealing with. Because grief can be very, isolating in so many ways, right? Sometimes you can be there around people, but emotionally you're pulled away, you're shut down. And so using things like this can help you, again, feel and release those emotions. There's actually not even people who do like Tai Chi, and there's actually now a trauma-informed Tai Chi, which I did one of those. I don't know if we have any here in PA. I'm sure there is. I've not found one yet, but I was at a conference in Georgia and was able to experience them. Like, that was so therapeutic. And that they can adjust the movements to your comfort level. And now even yoga, there are now trauma from yoga. So for those of us who have to release some emotions that are traumatic and painful, there's different ways that actually let our body even release those. Music, again, you mentioned that, mentioned it already. So listening or making music, you don't have to be in Grammy Award singer, in order to make music for your well-being, right? Sometimes it might just be a tap, and there's actually science not that prove rhythm helps us regulate. I'll say it again, rhythm helps us self-regulate. So whether it's, the listening to music in the background, the tapping sometime of just of your hands, or tapping of music in the background, it's a rhythm that actually, it helps your brain get into a rhythm as well, which reminds your brain there's order outside the chaos that you might be feeling. Go ahead, Victoria.
We just have some really good thoughts in the chat that I wanted to share. Yeah. We have cutting out pictures using magazines. Picture journaling is an excellent way to help children and those who are nonverbal. Yeah. And may not have the skills that they need to write. Making flowers is helping me to de-stress. Someone else also said there are many sites on Facebook with positive thoughts, like inspiringandpositivequotes.com or Peaceful Quotes or Life Rhino. And then someone else said deep breathing exercises or blowing bubbles is a good way to de-stress while having fun with children.
Beautiful. And adults. Adults can use bubbles too when there's no kids around. So yes, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So I hope that, for all of us, you're getting some new tips, some things that maybe you have not tried yet. Maybe, you'll be willing to try. But pet therapy, we don't have pets, but every chance my daughter will get, like, we'll go to PetSmart and she can, hold the cat for a little bit, and just a way that's soothing for her. Although she has a lot of allergies, but she'll put up with that and take her allergy medicine just so that she can go and have that therapeutic moment. So find what it is that you need in order to feel and release, because it's so easy to numb our emotions when we're hurting that sometimes it's not even just releasing the emotion of grief per se. Sometimes it's actually just giving yourself permission to release, to feel that we're present, and engage all the over senses. And as we do that, gradually we get to the point where we can release that grief as well. So the next permission that I invite you to do is the permission to remember. It's so easy, especially when it's a traumatic grief, or it's grief that others don't give validation to. When someone dies by suicide, for example, or they die by overdose, people like, oh, nobody wants to talk about it. But that person's life was still valuable. They've struggled with an addiction, maybe. They struggle with a mental health challenge, but we still want to remember who they were when they were healthy, who they were as an individual. And so it's okay to remember. And I know sometimes people are like, well, I just have to put that behind me because I don't want to feel it. I don't want to think about it. But if we put it behind us, it's going to catch up with us. And then we'll start back to the sponge analogy, where we'll start dripping everywhere that we don't want to drip. So there are some few ways to remember. What are some old rituals, things that you did with that loved one to celebrate holidays, for example? Maybe things that you did yourself to celebrate the holidays before you experienced this loss. If it's not a loss of a person, maybe loss of opportunity, loss somebody just away, for example. What are some things that you did to celebrate before? What did you do with the person that you want to continue doing? Just different activities. Sometimes it's just having their favorite meal on their birthday. Something that simple, right? And how does your family on your culture mourn? Because back to what I was saying about the lady from Indian background, where she felt like her grief was cut short because she didn't have the time that she needed to grieve the way that she would have grieved, culturally. So for her, it's just like almost like she still did not grieve. She actually had to take a whole vacation time later on to just allow herself to do that. Because sometimes that's all we need for closure. It's to do it the way that it makes sense to us, the way that it resonates with our culture. And we could be from the same country and still have different cultures. That's okay. How your family does it, so those rituals are very important as a way to grieve in a healthy way, because it brings you back to your roots. It brings you back to what your values, to what's important to you. It brings you back also to that sense of normalcy. And our brains need that normalcy when all of life is chaotic or left with all of everything out there we cannot control. So the things that we can control, I encourage you to indulge in it in healthy ways. But also some new rituals, like maybe if it's a person who's no longer here, whether could have physically moved away or they're physically not present anymore, they passed away, died. How would you like to remember them? How do you remember what you lost, for example? You can create the new rituals at your own way to honor that experience. And this is why, for example, when it's, experience we were able to do, or it was a trip you took, and now I can go back to Europe, for example, just throwing it out there for someone who wanted to go to Europe. But when you went there, can we capture those memories? Can we make those collages like some people mentioned here, right? Can we do things that remind us of that? So that, yes, maybe we might not be able to go acknowledge that, but we're still able to experience some of it in ways that make sense. And for caregivers, I often talk about to loss of identity and personal goals. Like I'm maybe not able to pursue the career that I wanted to have, for example. Then it's, what about that career can you still do right now? Maybe you're not able to work full time. I've been there too. But maybe you could still do things that relates to what matters to you, what you enjoy, as a way to still, yes, acknowledge that this is a loss, but still give yourself permission to remember that this is a part of your life. And including the person, or in future events. I actually have seen people who have a chair for their deceased father on the wedding day. And that's so honoring. Like it was just almost as a moment of reverence, honestly, for all of us. And so it could be something that others don't do. It doesn't have to be something that people do. What do you need to remember your loved one? Maybe it's, people still, it's okay to celebrate people's birthday after they're gone, because their life still matters. They were here, they made an impact, they were loved, you love them, their birthdays still matter. It's okay to celebrate, because holidays and anniversaries and birthdays are often the time where grief hits us the hardest. So if you find new ways to celebrate those things, it doesn't take the grief away, it just helps you grieve in a healthy way. All right, is there more messages there? Comments, not messages per se, but comments in the chat before we move on.
Someone said, my mother-in-law used to joke that her famous potato salad recipe would die with her. I used to help her make it, but after she passed away, I wasn't able to make that dish quite the same way. So we've been taking a break from trying to replicate it. We bought potato salad for Memorial Day picnics for years now. I think I may be finally ready to try to perfect it and make that food again in her honor.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And if you're like me, things never just look good on Pinterest. It does not look good when I make it. And that's okay too. But you can still have potato salad from the store in our honor. Right? So, give yourself some grace there too, that yes, you can try to perfect it for honor. But I think the fact that you're remembering that, to eat potato salad because of her, that's huge. That's huge. Yeah. All right. Third permission I want you to give yourself. Give yourself permission to live again, to enjoy life again. Many of us are here present and we're not living. I've been there. Again, this is not, a pointing fingers. This is a whole place. It's a safe place for all of us to process and learn together. It's okay to grieve privately. Sometimes we need that. I remember when my grandma died and I couldn't go back home. I'm originally from Africa. And that was hard. That was hard. And so I was here. I actually had a friend come and take my kids, and she was worried. She's like, I don't want you to be by home by yourself. And knowing that, my history of depression and anxiety, she's like, I don't want you to be home alone. And I knew, I appreciate that, but I also knew that I just need to be alone for that moment. And I told her, if you don't hear from me until this time, you feel free to call. But, I was safe. I just needed just to be alone, to be able to cry and not have to worry about taking care of anybody else in that moment. And sometimes we could do that, sometimes we can't. So if you're able to and you need that, that's fine. But even when you're grieving privately, you don't have to grieve alone. That's the difference, right? I want to be alone for a moment, but the journey of grieving, I couldn't do it alone, right? We all need support. And there's research after research after research that prove that support is actually the number one predictor of well-being. Because life will happen, life will hit us hard, that we're not sure, which way to go. But what helps us bounce back, the idea of resilience, is not the fact that we had no money in the bank. It's not always the fact that, we had the degrees or we had the good house or that we had to figure out and fix it. No, what helps us bounce back is the fact that we have support. And those of us as caregivers, we know that we all need support. With or without disability, everybody needs support. We all need a support for Zoom to be here on our computers today and do this, right? There's different levels of support. And in order for all of us to enjoy life fully, to have that everyday life, we need that support. So who can support you during this time? Think about people you trust. Reach out to old friends. That can actually be a great way to break that loneliness too. It's whether it's on the phone call. I remember, and I've done this, and I've actually seen and encouraged others to do this, where it's actually scheduling phone dates with friends that I know I couldn't see, like, loved ones back home in Africa for me, or many of them live in Europe now. I couldn't physically see them, but we'll schedule time to be in FaceTime or, on Zoom, so that it just was this regular time with friends, so that I was not isolating too much. Right? But maybe, look at what's around you. Now things are opening up again. There's a lot of things happening in person, some virtually, like this one. I love Eventbrite. That became my best friend since COVID. So look there for different things you can do online, things you can do in person. There's a lot of things where areas that may even be free. Try to do something new, right? But maybe starting a new hobby. Maybe like, well, I can't leave the house because I take care of my loved one. What can you do from home? My daughter's the queen of hobbies. Sometimes I wonder how she does it. This past, and like I mentioned, all my kids have autism. So this past Saturday, we needed a new light bulb in the car. It's a car that always have issues. And she went to what we call YouTube University and spent an entire weekend to figure out how to remove the light bulb and put it and replace it. And I was just thinking, this car just crashed at this point. Like, if the whole thing breaks, like that's the end of this vehicle. But she did it. She actually replaced the light bulb. That was a new hobby. She's like, I did not like mechanic. I'm like, yeah, just don't take anything else apart, but not cars. But it's something that she discovered. Also now, it's like she can maybe look more into it and do when she feels lonely, when she gets bored. Learning something new does not have to be a hobby. It could be, YouTube. Back to YouTube University, there's so many things you can learn there. But there are websites like Coursera and Skillshare where it's actually courses on different topics. Photography, for example. My daughter taught herself photography through like free classes like that. And join a support group. We have a support group under a program, I'll touch on a little bit, which talks, supports caregivers with an emotional part of caregiving, right? So you can have a safe place to process your stress. But the Philadelphia Parent Support Group is another way for you to just connect with other caregivers as well, other parents, and build that support system for yourself. And if you're grieving, there are different, again, Eventbrite will be a good place to still look, just like, support group my area, and Google as well. But there's there's grief share, which is actually a faith-based, but it's international and now international program, where if you Google them, then you can put your zip code. It can help you find grief support groups in your area. But there's more than that. So this is the first one that came to mind, so I'll put it there. but also realize that it's okay to seek support, professional support. That's why even in the beginning I said about how, I needed counseling, and I'm not ashamed to say it, because it helped me be where I am today. And even now, there's times where like I still need to go back and get extra help. And maybe for you, it's seeking help from your clergy, whether it's an imam or a priest or a pastor. You don't have to grieve alone. All right. I'll go to the next one here and share a little bit how we can help, but I'll pass it to Victoria first to read the chat there for me.
Well, one of them was me just putting the links to the support groups in there for February and March, for everyone to have access to. A couple of people said that they really have been enjoying this and found it helpful, but they had to go. And Jasa was sharing an experience with her daughter, and they found out that she wanted to take her life because of a drawing that she made, and the school counselor was able to figure out that it was her who had made the drawing, and then from that they were able to get her the support she needed.
Good. Yeah, we all need support. We all need support. But yeah, don't be ashamed to ask for that help, for sure. Yeah, so speaking of support, here's how we can help. Vision for Equality has many projects and many programs here. From what I do, Victoria and I have, for the Philly Family Support Project, we have the system navigation I mentioned earlier. So through this program, you get paired with a peer, which would be another caregiver, and just helps you kind of walk along that journey, so you don't have to navigate the system alone. So sometimes, even if it's grief or loneliness, especially caregiving, it's a lonely journey. You think about all the calls you have to make, not have to schedule. Like that was me even today. So it took time off work just to be making phone calls and coordinating stuff with therapists and case manager, and then, medical stuff, appointments we needed to schedule, and read through the lab work and get back. So there's so much you have to do. And sometimes you never know where to start, right? System navigation system helps you figure that out. What does your loved one need? What do you need in order to have a thriving life? And then we can help walk along the journey with you. What help you connect with, systems of care like, IDD system, or sometimes it just supports in your community. We've helped people with finding transportation and connecting to home health services, getting on the waiver. We've helped people, the list goes on and on. Housing has been one of them as well. Find doctors who take their insurance, find therapists. So it's, again, what you need, that's another place, for just get that support, so you don't have to figure it all by yourself. And sometimes we can make calls on your behalf as well when we have permission and need to do that. People get on SSI, for example, applying for disabilities. A lot. Right now, we've been helping a mom who wants to bring her daughter home from a group home. She wants her to leave home with her now. So we're helping her with that process. So yeah, accommodations at home, people getting ramps and, chair lifts and things like that, so the home can be safer for them. So if you need something, you just need to figure out, okay, my loved one needs something. Things can need to be different. We need more support in order to live a full life. Feel free to reach out to us. And then for a trauma-informed care project, this is kind of where these trainings kind of sit. So through the trauma-informed care project, we have the support group that we mentioned, where it's for caregivers to deal with stress. We learn different, things like this, how to deal with stress strategies. We do meditation always at the end. But we'll also talk about just the day-to-day things that are hard, and we share ideas about how to support one another. And also when someone needs additional support, like professional support for counseling, we can pair you with a counselor. When there's funding, we can cover a few sessions. And when someone has an insurance, we actually help them through their insurance find someone. And because there's wait lists, almost everywhere, sometimes even when they have insurance, we can connect you with someone for long term, but while you're waiting to be seen, while you're on the wait list for that, we can still cover a few sessions for that person through one of our counseling partners. And then we do a lot of trainings around these things that, right now we're calling it this caregiver stress series. So we talk about different things that create stress for caregivers. Frequent hospitalization was one of them. Holiday stress, so we did that. Time management, caregiver guilt, we have a whole training on that. And Victoria did a good job with that. And then like in February, I think Victoria put the links in the chat there. In February, we have a training on family dynamics. And then in March, it's kind of family dynamic, point two, if you want, that we'll talk about sibling dynamics. So that's kind of what we do here. And like I mentioned earlier, we now got funding to help with for supporting families who are birth to 5. I mean, before we're really supporting them, if we found them, now we're going to be intentionally looking for those families. So if you know a family who's just trying to figure out, even maybe they don't have an IDD or developmental disability or autism diagnosis yet, they're kind of going through that process, feel free to send them our way. We'll help them again navigate and find the support as well for themselves. So thank you so much. I know I'm over a few minutes here, but I'm here. This is my contact info. My email and the phone number is there. If we can be of any support, any assistance, please let us know. All the 3 projects that I mentioned, the system navigation, the trauma-informed care, and now our birth to 5 project are specifically funded for families in Philly. So if you or someone else, in Philadelphia, area needs that support, please reach out to us. Don't feel, if something just need a listening ear, that's the part of that trauma-informed care project as well, where, Victoria usually does most of theirs, and I do some as well, where you can just call and we just have time to just process together so that you're reminded that you're not alone. All right. So I'll hang out here. I'll pause the recording. If you have any questions, feel free to share. And but thank you all. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you